What's up, everyone? Welcome to our second lesson on the Mediterranean chapter, and probably the most favorite topic of all three artists, the lighting. That's right. Today we break down the lighting process. It's a pretty beefy lesson, one of the longest we have in our training, but we cover the technical aspect, compositional, color, lots to talk about. So yeah, I think it's a time to break the interior lighting once and for all. Hope you enjoy. So it might seem obvious, but actually lighting starts with 3D materials. Sure, lighting usually makes you think of, lights, but materials are also a key part of lighting. Materials and albedo are incredibly important to have proper lighting, deep shadows and all that. Let me show you what I mean here. Okay, so we are already in the interactive. This is the final result that we are going to end up with. But first, before we break it down, I want to discuss materials for a moment. We want to talk about plaster. Plaster is visible everywhere, so it will have a huge impact on the illumination. And let me illustrate it for you. At this moment, we have applied a basic shader without any textures, no bump, no glossiness, nothing. It's just a generic shader with 186 RGB brightness level. It's sort of gray, it's like 66% of brightness. And even though it's technically a gray material, when we look at our rendering, we perceive the walls as white. We achieve the natural illumination, rich shadows, and everything looks realistic. Shaders are gray, walls are white. Sounds totally weird, but that's how it should be. And to prove my point, let's do a little bit of an experiment here. Let's increase the albedo to 100%. So now it's getting brighter. Let's decrease the exposure and have something more balanced, closer to the previous one. And just like that, we immediately lose that natural look. We lose that nice light and shadow relationship. The wall and the ceiling blend into each other. They're basically almost the same in terms of brightness. Corners are washed out, and we pretty much lose all that nice spatial depth across the whole interior. So yeah, without changing the lighting, suddenly the illumination looks so much less realistic. Materials affect the lighting, and it doesn't stop there. Let me illustrate another issue with materials, and albedo in particular. We swap the floor with a wooden parquet. It's a common situation for an interior image. Now, with this wooden texture, everything feels natural and well balanced. But now, what if we increase the saturation of the wood texture? And look what happens. Suddenly, we get lots of unwanted reds everywhere, especially on the ceiling. It looks almost like a mold. And if we get even higher with the saturation, you can see how the color radiates basically everywhere. And it might seem obvious and borderline silly when the effect is exaggerated, but here's the point. Even with the slightly greenish and saturated floors, rays of light will pick that color, and every object in the scene will pick up that tint. The illumination will be off, but again, it's the materials. And you know what? Imagine if you apply LUTs on top of it, contrast, curves, total disaster. Lots of unwanted colors, and the biggest problem is that you don't have control over it anymore. It's slipping out of your hands. So yeah, the biggest takeaway here is don't make the walls or any significant surface too bright. Aim for like 60-80% of brightness, depending on the project, but don't go too bright and don't make them too dark either. Like don't go below 6 to 8% for the appearance of black walls. Also be careful of saturation. If your textures are too saturated, you can lower down the brightness and tone down the saturation, because your illumination will look better and you can increase the saturation in post-production. Easy fixes and less things to worry about. Okay, let's move on. For interiors, we're big fans of using native sun and sky systems. Whether you work in Blender, Cinema, Max or whatever, no HDRIs whatsoever. Let me show you why. This is our final lighting setup. This is how it looks. And let's remove the sky and focus on the sun only. Fast forward, through the magic of editing, everything is rendered out. We can play a little bit with the sun position. We can literally put it anywhere and test different options real fast. We get that freedom only with the native lighting systems. And at this stage, even though you might not be aware of it, we are essentially deciding what the image is about. If we highlight the sofa and put everything else in shadows, naturally the sofa will be the subject of our image. But if we put the sun in a different position, the image won't be about the sofa anymore. You know, this is like a monkey brain thinking. But yeah, I think it's important to say it out loud, because sometimes you have situations like this. Right now, the sun is falling on the wall in the far back. It is highlighting it. And when you think about it, I'm not sure if you want to do this. We have a very wide camera angle. We have the table in the front. We have the living room in the middle ground. But for whatever reason, with this sun direction, we are making the wall another important element in this scene. And since the wall is bright, we would probably make the table area even brighter, and therefore everything will go down the toilet, you know? Illumination will be so bright, you won't have any areas with deep shadows left. So yeah, you might not notice it when there's a sky illumination, but now it's very easy to understand that this is not the direction we want to go. But at the same time, it doesn't mean you shouldn't experiment with sun position. Quite the contrary. If you play around with it, you might find composition that wouldn't even cross your mind. In this case, the sun beams are highlighting the fireplace. It makes a different mood and essentially a different composition. But in this case, I think those shapes work quite well. It's a cool repetition of the window shape on the right, but very often those additional shapes work against your images, making them distracting and difficult to read. One quick tip here, always question where your sun beams are falling, and question if you even need them in the first place, you know? If your scene is extremely complicated, with a lot of different spaces, furniture, and details, you know, additional sunbeams will turn it into a hot mess. And while we cannot teach you everything about composition, I think it's important that you know what truly happens when you put a sun into your scene. It's not only lighting up the space, but it's affecting a composition as well. Moving on, in our initial setup, sun intensity was like 0.2 and the size of 10. And this is a very typical combination: low intensity and large sun disk. This gives us sunlight without too much intensity, with a slightly blurred edge. And it's a pleasant feel. And that's how we usually set it up. But now, here's the sun disk at a value of 20. We increased it a little bit. And even though the sun rays are nicely diffused, the overall illumination is not working. Suddenly, everything gets washed out again. We don't have deep shadows anymore, and we might add a curve to adjust it, but I think it's worth pointing out not to go too high with the sun disk. Yeah, and we definitely don't recommend making the sun extremely large. You might think you're getting a nice diffused light, but usually the sun is a very strong light. And most likely it will be so intense, you'll end up with a washed out look. All shadows will disappear and the lighting will become unrealistic again. So a quick tip again, for the appearance of soft overcast lighting, you can either remove the sun or actually position it in such a way that it doesn't directly penetrate the windows. It's a far better option from our experience. We will use it in our Parisian scene, but that's later to come. Last thing here, don't go too low with the sun size either. It creates harsh, distracting compositional lines that are useless. Strong compositional lines are only good if you want to complicate things. Okay then, so now if we reveal the sky, everything suddenly feels much more natural. The overall brightness becomes more balanced, and from our experience, we don't change the sky at all. We tend to embrace the natural cold-warm relationship and we don't fight against it. Some people prefer to make the sky more saturated, some people totally desaturate the sky for more of a stylized look. Either options is fine, and you have a lot of creative freedom in terms of how you want to do it. So yeah, adjust it to your preference. Sweet, so at this point we took care of albedo, we have the sun and sky in our scene, and it might seem super easy, and I think to a degree it is, but believe me, many people already complicate things a lot by this stage. People are having, I don't know, light portals, two suns, we've seen it, we've been there. I don't think that's the way. But anyway, if there's a point where it gets tricky, If there's a point where magic happens, it's the tone mapping, you know, it's the frame buffer. That's the real challenge when it comes to freaking awesome lighting, and a good one, you know? Okay, and all settings here in the tone mapping section can be really confusing, and honestly, we've seen people go wild here as well. Contrast at 10, 3 different curves, LUTs obviously, and whatnot. We've also been there, and there's, you know, okay, there's a clean way. It doesn't need to be accidental, it doesn't be shooting in the dark. Let's talk about it in more detail right now. Alright, so let's remove all the settings and see what happens. We can see that the scene is kind of unbalanced again. We have strong highlights, everything is pretty dark. And now, if you were to guess, what should we do here? Perhaps raise the exposure? Add additional lights? Nope. Next step is the tone mapping. And sometimes it's done for you, but more often than not, you need to set it yourself. And here's when things get tricky. After we apply ACES, which is one of the possible tone mappings, we get some details back. We don't have any burnouts or extreme highlight anymore, but at the same time, everything gets way darker. And since it's getting darker, we are effectively changing the relationship between light and shadow. And okay, even though it's dark, let's stick with ACES for now. Trust us for now. Let's move on, but we will get into this a little bit later. Let's play around with the exposure first and see what we get. Yeah, sure, it does make the interior look a bit more interesting, but unfortunately at some point we get those nasty burnouts again. Maybe some darker parts are looking better, but it's pretty much impossible to find a perfect value to make this whole interior look great. So yeah, we can increase it a little bit just before we start losing details. And at this point, there's something super duper important. After setting up the tone mapping, after exposure, we need to do the so-called mid-range curve correction. Mid-range curve correction, it might sound fancy, and probably it is fancy, but it's actually also very straightforward. You need to use a curve to brighten up the mid-range tones. You need to brighten up the dark areas. So yeah, if you look here, this technique gives you more control over the overall look without overexposing the highlights or losing details in the shadows. In nearly every interior project, we do some sort of curve correction. This is what gives that particular feeling to the interior. No LUTs, no additional lighting sources, no spheres, nothing like that, but just a curve. We can tone down the highlights a bit if they're too bright, but most importantly, we focus on the darker areas. Adjusting curves lets you shape the lighting, the perception of it. We can balance between a moody or a commercial feel. You can play with it and see how the scene behaves. And one technical tip here we can give you is to set a point here in the bottom, in the shadows, to protect them from being washed out. This should keep the overall punchiness of your image. And another thing is that you can use tour curves, you can make smaller adjustments, you can stack them up, you know. If you want to have greater control, you can just separate those and see how it works for you. But in general, mid-range curve correction is the next step after applying tone mapping and exposure. People often flood their scenes with light portals and light spheres, only to end up puzzled why the illumination feels off. And just as a reminder, we will discuss the different tone mappings, ACES, Filmic, Reinhardt, and curve adjustments in the next lesson. Okay, the last part, we are slowly bringing this lesson home. The last part is to discuss the artificial lighting, or in other words, relighting. Now and only now, we can start adding artificial lights. We want to make sure that everything is well balanced, we fix the albedo, and we didn't make anything weird with the tone mapping and all that. But anyway, if something still feels off, we can start shaping the light custom to our angle. We can brighten up some areas. We can cut off some lights coming in. All I'm saying is that we are cheating at this point, just to make your images a little bit more pleasant. And in this particular example, we used some spheres and some discs there in the kitchen. Let's see how they affect the image. Now it's looking much more pleasant. We wanted to brighten up this area. It was super dark, but at the same time, we don't want to overdo it. We have the overall balance, the overall illumination. So right now we are just fine-tuning it. We are removing those deepest shadows without overexposing everything else. This is exactly what Relight is great for. It helps to balance out tricky areas like this. Yeah, and that's that, guys. This is our setup. Some interiors are more tricky to illuminate, but in 90% of cases, If you follow this workflow and don't fall into any traps, I think you should be good to go. Fantastic. That's it for today. I hope it sheds some light on the interior lighting process and you enjoyed additional nuggets of knowledge. In the next lesson, we will go extremely nerdy and discuss the tone mapping in more detail. See you there.